Hello, my name is Satesh, and I am a research storyteller at Journal of Business Venturing Insights. At JBVI, we aim to highlight research that speaks to important and emerging conversations in entrepreneurship. One topic gaining a lot of attention recently is generative AI, particularly on how it shapes entrepreneurial decision making, innovation, and the future of small businesses. Across fields, scholars are beginning to explore how these technology influence entrepreneurs and ventures. Recent discussions, including work featured at JBVI, are asking important questions about how generative AI affects opportunity recognition, venture creation, and everyday entrepreneurial practice. Today, we are adding to that broader conversation by spotlighting a study that looks at how generative SMEs are using AI to support business sustainability. This paper is especially meaningful to highlight because I am also one of the co authors. The study was led by Dr. Priscilla Bahaw and co authored with David Forgenie, Ghulfam Sadiq, and myself, and it is currently published in Sustainable Futures. In this research, we explore how SMEs in the small island developing state are using generative AI to help balance profit, people, and the planet, the three pillars of sustainable business. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Priscilla Bahaw, the lead author of the study, to discuss what motivates the study and what we can learn from working closely with businesses in the field. So let's jump in. Dr. Bahaw, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, well, thank you so much for having me. Now, let me tell you, we kept hearing a lot of talk about AI, especially generative AI. And most of the research was focused predominantly on large companies, big companies, and also in the more developed side of the world. But meanwhile, SMEs, the smaller enterprises, especially in small island economies, we saw that they were already experimenting with tools like ChatGPT, for example, but their experiences really, they weren't being captured. And what was surprising to us was that these businesses weren't just curious. Many of them, they were already using generative AI in practical ways, even with the limited resources that they had.
Okay, so this wasn't about the future. It was all about what's already happening on the ground, right?
Yes, yes, certainly, most certainly.
All right, perfect. So now we'll be jumping into how did you conduct the research, right? So before we get into the findings, let's talk briefly about how you went about the study.
Oh, I'm glad you asked. We adopted a mixed methods approach. So that means that we would have combined both quantitative and qualitative data collection methods, right? So what that means is on the quantitative side, we surveyed the SME owners to really understand the trends, to really understand what drove their generative AI adoption. And this was, we relied on the technology acceptance model. This is also known as TAM, and it basically asks two main questions. It looks at the variables, whether the technology was actually useful, so how useful it was, and also not just how useful it was, but how easy it was to adopt, how easy it was to actually use. So that was primarily what we studied in the quantitative side in order to test how those two variables would have informed their continued use of generative AI in terms of intentions to use it and actual usage. But here's the sweet part. We then complemented that with qualitative insights, and that is what makes this research very interesting because we went out to the field and we spoke directly with SME owners to understand how, not just what drove them, but how they were actually using the generative AI. And this is how we were able to tie it in to how they saw it in terms of improving the sustainability processes of their businesses.
Right. And you also looked at sustainability more broadly, right?
Yeah, yeah. We actually use a framework, a known framework called the triple bottom line framework. And that basically looks at sustainability from the lens of economic, environmental, and social outcomes. So, ideally, when we looked at generative AI, we were getting insights from them, not just only on profits, but planet and people.
Right, perfect. So now let's look at what drives SMEs to adopt generative AI, right? So what did you find and what actually pushes SMEs to adopt generative AI?
Well, from this research, I would say that there were two things that really stood out, and that was perceived usefulness and their perceptions of how easy it was to use the technology. If business owners believed AI would help them save time, cut costs, or even improve decision making, they were far more likely to use it. And then ease of use was also very, very huge. Even owners without the strong technical backgrounds adopted AI if the tools felt intuitive enough that it didn't really require them to have to go through a long training program or even require a steep learning curve.
Right. And that's very important because it suggests that adoption isn't just about having tech experts on staff, right?
Exactly. It's more about the user-friendly design because that could definitely lower the barrier to adopt it. If it's the more user-friendly it is, we see that it really impacts, how willing they were to try the technology. And especially in environments where, there's limited resources, resource-constrained environments, we feel this is particularly an important finding.
Right. Now let's look at how SMEs are actually using Gen AI, right? So let's talk about real world use and how are SMEs using generative AI for their day-to-day.
Wow, there's a lot to unpack there. But to sum it up, I would say we saw four main applications. First, we want to talk about operational efficiency, right? We saw that businesses use AI for basic administrative tasks like emails, invoices, basic reporting, things like that. Secondly, they utilize it for driving their decision-making processes using a more data-driven approach. So the AI helped them to like analyze their sales, even help with forecasting, and also thinking through, their resource requirements and their resource use. Thirdly, I would say sustainable product and service innovation also stood out. So some of the businesses use AI to help with their prototyping, to prototype eco-friendly products, for example, and also to explore more sustainable materials, alternative but sustainable materials. And then the fourth application, I would say, would be that of building a sustainable brand identity. And this was a unique finding because what the generative AI did for them is that it helped them to generate consistent messaging around sustainability, social media, advertising, different things like that. They were able to use the technology to make life easier for their image in that sense. And then that also helped them to focus on keeping what they're doing very authentic and local. And it was a very unique thing we saw in terms of how they applied it. So yes, indeed,
Right.
they really utilized it in so many different ways.
Yeah, and that's definitely very interesting to hear as well, because we would also think that AI is sort of replacing people. So it's very interesting to hear that AI is not replacing persons. Matter of fact, it is freeing up time and capacity, right? All right. So
Yes,
next we'll be looking at some of the challenges and limitations. Because of course, as you know, it wasn't all smooth sailings, right?
definitely. Yes. Data privacy, accuracy, and over reliance were some real concerns. In fact, many of the owners were cautious about trusting AI outputs blindly. And from a research perspective, we also acknowledge limitations because this our study, it was done on one small island developing state and it relies on self-reported data. So we can't generalize everything globally.
Definitely. I definitely agree with that. But also with even though with those limitations, I would say that the insights are very much valuable.
Absolutely. In fact, they show what's possible when SMEs are given accessible tools.
Right. All right. So as we come to closing off this paper on this segment, let's look at some of the call to actions and of course some of the conclusions, right? So let's end with impact. What should SME owners take away from this study?
Hmm, what should SME owners take away? Well, I would tell them, don't see generative AI as something only big firms can use. Start small, use it to save time, use it to help improve your decision making. And from our study, we saw it can help support your sustainability endeavors. Also, I would say stay involved. AI works best when humans remain in control, adding context and judgment to it, of course, right? So you have to be careful in that regard.
And yeah, I definitely agree with that last point with keeping control, right? That's very important. And of course, we must have some takeaways for our policymakers as well.
Absolutely. So for the policymakers out there, if you're hearing us, right, focus on education and outreach. Digital skills, they matter just as much, if not more, than infrastructure. So we want to make sure that you make AI practical, relatable, even accessible for the SMEs. And if done right, generative AI can help businesses balance profitability with social and environmental responsibility. And that's a huge win.
Definitely. And I think that's a great place to end. I want to say thank you so much, Priscilla, and of course, your co-authors. And of course, thanks to our listeners for being here. If you're an SME owner or policymaker, the message is clear. Generative AI isn't the future, it's already here. So the real question is, how do you choose to use it? So we hopefully we see you next time. Thanks so much. Take care.